This video will be an in-depth look at how to home can ground meat. In this video, we will only use instructions from the National Center for Home Food Preservation and the USDA. The first thing that you have to do is use a pressure canner. You cannot use a water bath canner to can meat. This recipe will work for any ground meat: beef, bear, lamb, pork, sausage, veal, and venison. Before starting, check over your equipment and make sure that everything is working properly. You should use fresh chilled or pre-frozen ground meat. If you're going to use venison, you should add 1 part high-quality pork fat to 3 or 4 parts of venison before grinding. Remember, you must use a pressure canner in order to can meat. For the liquid, you could use either water, beef base, soup mix, or even tomato sauce. If you were using anything besides water, mix per instructions. I used about 1 cup of prepared liquid per pint jar. Just bring your liquid to a boil. At the same time, you can start browning your ground meat in a separate pan. Browning the meat will help with the consistency and end product. Raw canned meat tends to be more mushy than doing it this way. Once your meat is brown and cooked thoroughly, you'll want to drain off the fat. The reason that you want to drain the fat is because that is what will go rancid first. Fat has the shortest shelf life of your types of nutrients. So less fat will equal a longer shelf life. Once you've ground your meat, if you use a slotted spoon to move the meat into the jars, it will help remove even more of the fat. You can also use a canning funnel in order to help keep the sides clear from the jars. You should be sure to leave at least 1 inch of headspace at the top of the jars. Trust me on this one, I did not do this and it caused me a lot of issues. You probably won't get quite a pound of your meat into each of the pint-sized jars, and as tempting as it may be to overfill in order to get 1 pound in each jar, it just won't work with the pint-sized jars. And the reason I don't suggest going up to quart-sized jars is because the processing time is longer, which could cause consistency issues with your meat and make it a little bit mushier. Next, you'll ladle the broth into each jar. You'll want to make sure to cover all of the meat in the jars, and don't forget to leave that 1 inch of headspace. After doing this, you'll use a spatula to make sure to remove any air bubbles that may be underneath. Lastly, you'll want to wipe the rims of the jars with the vinegar water in order to make sure that there's nothing on the rims that will cause seal failures. You definitely won't want to skip the steps of making sure there's the 1 inch of headspace or the wiping of the rims. Forgetting either of these steps will increase your failure rates. Next, you'll just tighten the lids finger tight before you put them into your pressure canner. You will add about 3 inches of water to the bottom of your pressure canner. And don't forget that the cans don't sit directly on the bottom of the canner. There should be a little metal tray that you put in the bottom before you put the cans in. First thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that you exhaust your canner for 10 minutes. Exhausting the canner is just another way to say venting. Venting is the process of letting the steam come out of the canner for a period of time before you seal the canner down to bring up the pressure. Fun fact, without proper venting, up to 30% of the sterilizing value of a 20-minute process could be lost. So you definitely don't want to skip this step either. Check out the handy table. It will help you determine the amount of pressure and the time that you have to process your jars. Because I'm under 2,000 feet of altitude and I'm using pint-sized jars, my processing time will be 75 minutes with 11 pounds of pressure. Only 14 states have highest points below 2,000 feet altitude, so you may want to look that up before you start canning. Now my canner happens to have both weights and a dial, so I'm just going to be safe and go with the 11 pounds for the dial because it's greater than the 10 pounds for the weighted. Once the 10 minutes of exhausting the canner is up, that's when you put your weights on. If you are using weighted gauges, then what you need to do is put 10 pounds on top of your canner. After adding the weights, the pressure canner will begin to build up pressure, and you need to wait for it to reach 11 pounds. Once the canner reaches 11 pounds of pressure, then you can start your timing. If it ever falls below the 11 pounds, you have to start your timing over. Remember, if you fall below the amount of pressure that you need for the canning, at any time during the process, you will have to start your count over. Once your timer's up, you can turn off the stove and your pressure canner will start going back down to 0. Once your canner is back down to 0 pounds of pressure, then you can safely open the lid without getting scalded. If you open the lid too early, you do risk being scalded from the steam. Be safe, be careful, and wait for the canner to cool before you open the lid. You will notice that there may be fat on the outside of the cans, and if that happens, that's not a big deal, but you do have to check to make sure the lid's sealed. After your jars cool and you've heard the popping sound from the lids, the popping sound will help you know that your jars have sealed, but you need to check them still after they cool. Once the jars cool, remove the rings so that you can check the lids. You can do this by pushing down on the top of the lid to make sure that the lid does not pop back up. It should have sealed well enough that even if you try to pry it off with your fingers, you should not be able to do that. If you can remove any lid with just your hands, then it did not seal properly. If you catch any unsealed lids within 24 hours, they are safe to reseal. The other option for unsealed lids is to put them in the refrigerator and use them right away. Before using a jar, examine its lid for tightness and vacuum. Lids with concave centers have good seals. Make sure that the lids do not pop back up when you push down on the center of the lid. While opening the jar, smell for unnatural odors. Look for spurting liquid and mold growth on the surface of the food and on the underside of the lid. If any container looks suspect, do not use it. As you can see, the consistency is pretty good. The meat held together well after the pressure canning. While I really don't like onion soup mix, it worked out really well in this recipe. This recipe was from the Needy Homesteader, canning ground beef with au jus, and it was excellent. The onion soup mix did not taint the flavor of the beef at all. As a matter of fact, you couldn't even tell that there was onion flavor in the beef at all. I would also note that there was no added salt other than what was in the soup mix. And when I opened this can, I did have to add salt to it. It wasn't salty enough for my taste. The consistency and taste of this recipe was really good. It did not taste like onion soup. You could use this recipe as an ingredient in many different recipes. Home canned foods will last longest if stored in a cool, dry, dark, temperate environment. According to the USDA, properly canned food stored in a cool, dry place will remain optimum eating quality for at least 1 year. However, on askaprepper.com, they suggest that canned ground meat can last 3 to 5 years without deteriorating in quality and can even be edible longer. This lines up very well with some other YouTubers that I've watched. I did find it interesting that the USDA also says that you do not have to sterilize the jars before canning. However, if you are using older versions of lids, they do need to be boiled before canning with them because it softens up the rubber. However, if you are using the new ball sealed tight lids, you do not have to boil them ahead of time, and it will actually increase your failure rate if you do. Now let's assume that we only need 1 year's worth of meat stored on the shelf. The USDA suggests 1 cup per person per day. And as we learned, 1 cup fits in almost into 1 pint jars. So you will need 365 pint jars per person per year of just canned meat, according to the USDA's recommendation. If you're already familiar with canning, check out my YouTube short videos. They'll just have the basics that you need to get started.